Leipzig, GDR, October 1989. Police violently repressed protesters gathered to demand the right to leave the country freely. There are only a few hundred of them, and yet it's the start of a movement which, to general surprise, will send the Berlin Wall tumbling a few weeks later. Romania, Bucharest, December 1989. Dictator Nicolae Ceausescu organizes a rally to promote pay rises in the hope of appeasing the widespread discontent growing across the land. But things don't go as planned. The crowd storms his palace. Ceausescu takes flight, but he will be caught that same day, given a summary trial, and executed 4 days later. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, December 2010. This amateur footage shows people stoning the facade of the governorate building. This isn't the first riot to flare up in Ben Ali's Tunisia, but this time it's different. You're witnessing the outbreak of the Arab Spring. An uprising that would spread like wildfire to 15 countries and bring down 3 dictatorships. How a simple riot triggers such a mechanism is a mystery. And it's this mystery behind such uprisings that we're about to explore. Paris, May 3rd, 1968. Students gathered in the main courtyard of the Sorbonne University. All of the anti-establishment leaders and protesters were present. But little did they know that things were about to change dramatically.
What happened in the Latin Quarter on May 3rd wasn't completely new. There had always been protests, but I'm talking about people in their hundreds. That was relatively frequent in the springtime.
There were alarmist rumors about a punitive raid by the far-right wing. The far right was quite strong in the Latin Quarter, as the Algerian War and the OAS paramilitary movement was still recent. But we stood firm and waited for them with a certain degree of pleasure.
At that moment, a first event changed everything. Fearing confrontations, the dean of the university called and asked the police to evacuate the Sorbonne. But the students thought the police had the right to enter the university grounds. They were wrong, but they were all convinced of it.
L'administration a décidé de déclarer hors la loi ceux qui sont dans la Sorbonne, donc ils occupent la Sorbonne. Politiquement, il faut exactement savoir ce que maintenant nous allons faire, car la situation est nouvelle.
Ce qui frappe, ce qui marque.
The striking thing at that particular moment was the intervention of the police inside the Sorbonne itself. That was something that just wasn't done. A line was crossed, and it would have considerable consequences.
The police arrived in numbers, intent on rounding up the protesters and keeping them in custody at the various police stations in Paris. But then, a second unforeseen event occurred.
As there were a lot of people to round up, a couple of hundred of us, and as there weren't enough paddy wagons, they only arrested the men. They let all the young women go, and they rushed around telling the whole Latin Quarter and the other universities what was going on at the Sorbonne. And from inside the paddy wagons, we witnessed the building up of a big protest. We were very surprised because all the student leaders and politicized militants were being carried off to the police stations. And we wondered who could be organizing this huge demonstration. But it was totally spontaneous.
We felt something was in the air, but we weren't sure what. It wasn't the kind of militant action we were accustomed to.
The police decided to disperse the crowd, and the first baton blows rained down. Anyone in the path of the CRS riot police was blindly targeted. Like this woman and her husband, who happened to be driving by. But the police were unable to break up the spontaneous gathering of youngsters and simple passers-by outraged by the police violence. Reactions were impulsive, as all those present on the street that day were overcome with raw emotion. And there you have it. An ordinary student meeting, a hasty decision to evacuate, a problem of police logistics. In short, a sudden chain of unforeseen events. Who would have predicted that a few hours earlier? Nobody. In a matter of hours, the Latin Quarter was transformed into a battlefield. The French uprising of May 1968 had just begun. Beijing, April the 15th, 1989. Hu Yaobang, former General Secretary of the Communist Party, had just died of a heart attack. But nobody had foreseen what his death would unleash within the 46 universities of the Chinese capital.
The death of Hu Yaobang was an unforeseen incident. After his death, we felt deep regret because he'd been forced out of politics and power. He'd been forced to resign from his post in 1987, and that was due to the previous student movement. To us, he was a symbol of hope.
Hu Yaobang was one of the most open-minded of Communist Party leaders. His being ousted from power and his eventual tragic end were linked to the student movement. So we students felt we owed him something. We were all very sad. His death was a big shock to us.
The next day, April the 16th, 1989, on the campus of Beida, Beijing's main university, posters commemorating the former reformist leader began to appear in public. Students started to gather and talk. Then an idea was suggested to march peacefully together to Tiananmen Square to lay wreaths. Never mind that gathering and protest was strictly forbidden on Tiananmen Square.
The students really wanted to attend his funeral to show that our aspirations and desires were totally natural.
We wanted to show that we loved our country, and we truly believed the government would appreciate that.
Monday, April the 17th, 1989. A few thousand students defied the ban. Despite breaking the rules, their behavior was restrained. But they gradually began to attract curious bystanders who swelled the protesters' ranks. As yet, there was no clear organization and no obvious leader. They demanded talks with the authorities, respect of the law, and an end to corruption. But the amazing truth of the matter was, in a totalitarian state, they dared to gather on Tiananmen Square, the symbolic heart of the regime. Who would have foreseen that 3 days earlier? Nobody. Iran, autumn 1977. The Shah, the absolute monarch, ruled the country with an iron fist. He had successively crushed the liberal opposition and the left-wing rebellion. He had decreed westernization as the way forward for his country and had managed to subdue the powerful clergy. Ayatollah Khomeini, an old man in exile in Iraq, was leading a private war against the Shah. But having been banished from his homeland for 15 years, he'd been forgotten by almost everyone.
He was relatively known among students who were, let's call them religious. He was also known in certain towns and cities by part of the population of the city of Qom, for example, by the student community, the Taliban, if you like. But at that time, he wasn't the head of the Iranian clergy.
The city of Qom is the largest center of Shia Islam in the world. For 100 years, it has been home to the theological center where much of the Iranian clergy study.
At the time, the majority of the leading clerics weren't on good terms with Khomeini. He was too authoritarian and too radical in his political activities, and they didn't appreciate that.
On October 23, 1977, Mustafa Khomeini, the Ayatollah's eldest son, died in suspicious circumstances. This was followed by a religious ceremony in Qom, where, for the first time in years, the name Khomeini was pronounced in public.
Then there was another ceremony in a mosque in Tehran. It was during this ceremony that a cleric first used the term imam for Khomeini. After that, it became common usage. Everyone systematically talked of the Imam Khomeini.
The term imam in Shia Islam is reserved for prophetic figures. Khomeini's supporters thus placed him above other ayatollahs, to the great dismay of Iran's leading clerics. Khomeini saw this first unforeseen event as a chance to make his political comeback. He thus stepped up his own propaganda, which is spread with cassette tapes.
Khomeini's cassettes started circulating in Tehran and Qom. They weren't an immediate resounding success. They were popular, but not sensationally so. They notably attacked the Shah, who was an incredibly sensitive man, and he took any forms of criticism very badly. The minister of the imperial court asked him, "Why don't you answer back?" The Shah answered with his characteristically flippant, "Why not?" and gave the order to his advisors to start writing an anti-Khomeini article. And this article, notably due to the personal attacks, for example, Khomeini having practiced homosexuality in his youth, true or not, nobody cared, provoked a reaction in Qom.
This article angered the people of Qom, and the same day there was a spontaneous demonstration. The protesters marched to the homes of the city's religious leaders to ask for their support.
The aim for these several hundred protesters was to force religious leaders, including Ayatollah Shariat Madari, to come out in favor of Khomeini.
Most of the protesters gathered outside the home of Ayatollah Shariat Madari, where there was a clash with the police. One person was even killed.
The killing of a Khomeini supporter outside the home of Qom's chief Ayatollah would oblige religious leaders to adopt a stance they had until then refused to adopt.
And the entire clergy felt obliged, though more through corporatism, to stand up for Khomeini.
An isolated old man living in exile, spreading his own propaganda on cassettes. A defamatory article, a local protest clumsily broken up, and the entire Iranian Shia clergy forced into backing Ayatollah Khomeini. The exiled Khomeini suddenly found himself as the figurehead of an uprising. Who would have foreseen that 2 days earlier? Nobody. (1980). Poland was a small satellite state of the Soviet Union. Its entirely state-run economy was in a mess. Strikes were frequent, and the government had adopted the habit of appeasing the workers with pay rises. But a handful of activists had formed the Workers' Defense Committee, an informal group of intellectuals and laborers. Their aim, to force the state to recognize free trade unions and to allow workers to organize themselves freely. To these activists, free trade unions represented the first step in enabling the whole of Polish society to free itself from the yoke of communist dictatorship.
From 1978 on, as the democratic opposition, we did everything we could to cause a strike. But we weren't thinking of a huge general strike. We didn't know how big it would turn out to be. We wanted the strike to have a strong impact on people's minds. We felt the time was right, but it didn't work out like that.
In July 1980, the state raised the price of meat, provoking a new series of strikes.
The strikes were quickly brought to an end when agreements were signed, but the general mood had not changed. Workers felt a sense of buoyancy. Then in August, the communists gave us a big gift by dismissing Anna Valentinowicz.
Dowiedzieliśmy się, że zwolniono Annę Walentynowicz, pracownicę stoczni gdańskiej imienia Lenina, która przepracowała w stoczni 30 lat. 16 lat pracowała jako spawacz, została zwolniona dyscyplinarnie. Po prostu nas to zabolało, że jeśli się takich ludzi zwalnia jak pani Walentynowicz, która ma brązowy medal, srebrny i złoty, to co może będzie później robić można z nami.
Dyrektor wyjaśnił, że takich pracowników jak Walentynowicz on sobie nie życzy w stoczni.
Anna Valentynowicz, a worker at the Lenin shipyard in Gdańsk and a long-time activist for free trade unions, received a letter dismissing her from her job on August the 7th, 1980. Not only did the management take advantage of her absence due to illness to fire her, but worse, Anna Valentynowicz, at only a few months off retirement, lost all her rights to receive a pension. Her co-workers were scandalized, but for the free trade union activists, the dismissal was manna from heaven. Even non-militant workers, those who rarely took to the streets, demanded industrial action.
People were so angry and so impatient that the strike movement just grew and grew at an incredible pace.
On August the 14th, the 17,000 workers at the Lenin shipyard went on strike and declared that they would occupy the yard until their dismissed colleague was reintegrated. On August the 15th, the strike spread to neighboring shipyards. On August the 16th, solidarity strikes began throughout the Gdańsk region. 370 companies and 400,000 employees were now involved. The solidarity uprising had just begun. Who would have foreseen that a few days earlier? Nobody. Sidi Bouzid, Tunisia, December the 17th, 2010. A few minutes before the scene, a street vendor, Mohamed Bouazizi, set fire to himself because the police had confiscated his fruit and vegetable stall. This footage, filmed on a cell phone, shows the emergency services about to take the young man to hospital. This dramatic event immediately sparked a spontaneous gathering outside Governorate headquarters.
On that day, there were no demands made. It was simply a protest. Well, the only demand was that those responsible for what had happened to Bouazizi be brought to justice.
For now, the case of Mohammed Bouazizi was a news-in-brief item.
A few weeks before that, another youngster, Abdeselem Trimesh, set fire to himself in Monastir, a tourist resort. But it didn't have the same nationwide political and economical impact. It only had an impact on his family. It remained a news-in-brief item, if you like.
Soon, a second piece of information, important but totally false, began to spread across the country. The young man in question was a university student. How did this information circulate, and who was responsible for it?
A few days earlier, a certain Mohammed Bouazizi posted a little poem on his Facebook page. I want to depart, I've had enough, and so on. So when people started looking up Bouazizi on the internet, they hit on the Mohammed Bouazizi who had recently declared that he wanted to depart this life. And that particular Mohammed Bouazizi was an engineering graduate. What's more, the news called him Mohammed Bouazizi when on his identity card his official name was Tariq, but his mother always called him Mohammed.
And that's how the street vendor Tariq Bouazizi, alias Mohammed, became Mohammed Bouazizi, a young graduate unable to find work. The next day, December the 18th, 2010, was the day of the weekly market in Sidi Bouzid.
The event from the day before became an incredible catalyst. And the people, especially youngsters, marched on the governorate.
And that's how a weekly market became another occasion for people to gather. Popular emotion and the success of the previous day's protest did the rest.
A riot flared up. When the police charged the protesters dropped back, only to regroup and come back in even greater strength to besiege the governorate. From then on, things snowballed. Police reinforcements arrived, but so too did more protesters. People came running from everywhere, from all over the town of Sidi Bouzid, and even its suburbs.
When I saw people protesting and continuing to do so, despite the police repression, I realized that something big was going on, especially as it wasn't being organized by political parties. It was spontaneous. It came right from the people.
A street vendor setting fire to himself, false information spreading over the web, and a market day turning into a riot. Who would have foreseen that 24 hours earlier? Nobody. A problem with police logistics, the death of a former leader, a newspaper article defaming an exiled religious leader, a job dismissal, a young man burning himself alive. These very different events all have something in common. They were both sudden and unforeseen. In other words, accidents. An uprising is therefore, by nature, unpredictable. No government, no opposition party, no secret service agency in the world is able to see them coming. Not even the fiercest hatred of the powers that be, the most extreme discontent, frustration of poverty are enough to spark an uprising. An uprising is first and foremost an unexpected, localized movement, with no organization or predefined slogans. From the outset, there's a sudden mobilization of people who usually never get involved in politics or demonstrations. But an accident, an uprising, isn't enough to cause a rebellion. The initial movement needs to be kept alive. Paris, May the 4th, 1968. The riot that had flared up in the Latin Quarter the previous day was fresh in everyone's mind. It had taken the capital by surprise, especially since it had arisen without the presence of militants and left-wing leaders who had been rounded up and held in several Paris police stations.
We were released quite soon, and the movement's leaders all met up at the École Normale Supérieure in the Rue d'Ulm to take stock and decide on the next step, namely a show of force against the powers that be.
Some of the rioters from May the 3rd weren't released and were even given prison sentences.
It was completely outrageous. Sentences of 2 to 3 months. So yes, things got out of control, but totally out of control from those who opposed us.
The police took over the Latin Quarter and the Sorbonne was cordoned off. 2 more events that increased the students' anger. For the left-wing militants, this unexpected situation was an unhoped-for chance to spring into action. Everything had to be done to keep the student uprising going. Joined by the main student union, UNEF, they called for a huge protest march on Monday, May the 6th at 6:30 in the evening. Monday, May the 6th started out quietly with a disciplinary hearing concerning an event that had happened some time ago. The accused, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, and several brothers-in-arms for having sparked trouble at the University of Nanterre.
Rien à dire. Vous comprenez, il y a des flics à côté. On va pas quand même déclarer aux flics comment nous on va se défendre. Soit prescrit par une juridiction universitaire qui soi-disant bénéficie des franchises universitaires. Alors dans ce cas, la police a à se tailler. Ou alors c'est vraiment un procès politique contre des étudiants et on le fait au palais de justice avec tout le tintamarre, des avocats, le spectacle.
In front of the cameras, Cohn-Bendit fulfilled his role as an agitator. The group of 50 or so people we see here are a mixture of reporters, policemen, militants come to support their comrades, and curious passers-by. Little did they know what would take place in an hour's time. At 10 a.m., a crowd gathered spontaneously around the Sorbonne, much to everyone's surprise.
The Sorbonne was cordoned off, so people gathered outside the Sorbonne, even those who didn't know about it. Then they informed others, then people started arriving from all over the place. Basically, all kinds of people gathered in the adjacent streets, and it turned into a massive demonstration, the likes of which we hadn't seen for a long time.
Things began to escalate. This young man pushing a policeman from behind could be a student, but he could also be just a passerby caught up in the mood.
There were more and more people, different people. People who didn't know each other. They gathered there for whatever reason, curiosity, wanting to be there. There was a definite desire to protest, to be on the street and to face off against the police. That's for sure.
Late in the afternoon, after several hours of clashes, the police managed to clear part of the Latin Quarter, and a relative calm descended. But let's not forget the protest march originally planned for 6:30 p.m, which was about to leave from nearby Place d'Enfer Rochereau. The massed ranks headed for the Sorbonne. There are no banners yet, but we can already hear the first chants in unison. This time, the protesters made their demands clear, giving real meaning to these events that had shocked the world. Now, some 30,000 protesters descended on the Latin Quarter.
It was joyful. There's no other way to describe it. It was a moment of great happiness. After that, the night would go on.
C'est l'affrontement.
Clashes continued into the night of May the 6th.
In the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th arrondissement, there were daily demonstrations, growing in size and with different setups to keep the media in suspense.
It was something we had never seen before, not in our lifetime at least. So, for several days, we swung back and forth between two possibilities. Do we let them build barricades? Because if we intervene, there'll be violence, and God knows what that will result in. Or do we send in the riot police to prevent barricades being set up? We hesitated for a whole week over these two arguments.
They weren't military-type barricades, but in the tradition of the French working classes and the people of Paris, building barricades is a statement of intent.
Barricades are indeed a Parisian tradition. They've always been part of any insurrection calling for a change of regime.
In the end, we were faced with the barricades, and then...
Je suis au milieu du boulevard Saint-Germain et il y a une femme qui est allongée. Elle est allongée, elle est complètement en sang. Voici les étudiants qui chargent maintenant. Reculez! Les étudiants chargent. Écoutez, ça y est, ça charge maintenant, nous sommes derrière. Nous sommes derrière, les gardes mobiles, ça pleut dans tous les sens. C'est épouvantable, ce sont des dizaines, des centaines de cailloux, de pavés qui volent maintenant.
Not only did the uprising last a whole week, but the extreme violence of the night at the barricades was a sign that the situation was bordering on revolution. Beijing. Following the sudden demonstration of Monday, April the 17th, 1989, intent on paying tribute to the deceased Hu Yaobang, the students began to organize themselves so that they could hold out until his state funeral on Sunday, April the 23rd.
We were good students of the Communist Party, and when the party taught us its history, it always underlined one thing: the importance of being well organized. Thank you, party. We learned our lesson well.
The students of Beijing's 46 universities joined ranks as an autonomous federation and declared the abolition of so-called official students' unions. They elected leaders, including Wei Kaixi and Wang Dan.
I had huge responsibilities. The first was to make sure no harm came to the students in the movement. So we immediately advocated certain policies such as non-violence, staying calm, etc. We wanted to avoid any stigmatization from the government. We couldn't let the government accuse us of violence. In that way, we hoped to win the support of the people of Beijing.
It was also what we had learned in our history lessons. We were inspired by Gandhi. The spiritual nature of protest was what was most important to us.
The movement now had an organization, leaders, and a strategy based on non-violence. Tuesday, April the 18th, several thousand students held their first organized meeting on Tiananmen Square, and they made their first demands publicly known. The demands were written on a petition that the students planned to present to Prime Minister Li Peng. Wednesday, April the 19th, 1989, 11 p.m. For the second night running, the students tried to hand their petition to the Prime Minister. This time, in exasperation, they attempted to force the doors of Communist Party headquarters. The episode would end at 5 a.m. when 500 hardcore protesters were forced to retreat by a police baton charge. Having fully assumed his role as leader, Wei Kaishi tried to keep the movement alive, all the while advocating its strategy of non-violence.
We thought that if we could keep the movement going until mid-May, we would be able to put real pressure on the government.
In mid-May, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was due to visit China to seal the Sino-Soviet reconciliation. The world's cameras would all be focused on Beijing. Sunday, April the 23rd, 1989. Xu Yaobang's state funeral took place against a backdrop of unrest. The authorities rushed through the procedure in order to bury the former leader as quickly as possible, in the hope of bringing an end to the student movement. But outside, the students were still demanding talks. The students chose 3 delegates to present their petition, and they had the firm intention of keeping the movement going until the authorities agreed to talks. It now seemed as though Xu Yaobang's funeral would not bring the uprising to an end. Iran. The first harshly reprimanded protest in Qom had forced the Shia clergy to back Ayatollah Khomeini. From Iraq, where he was in exile, Khomeini seized at this unhoped-for chance and urged his supporters to keep the religious uprising going.
People of my generation, those who thought like I did, we were so sure of our ideals that we feared neither jail nor death. We were prepared for anything.
Theology students believe in a tradition that's particular to Shia Islam, in which the martyr has a fundamental role. In the Shiite religion, the dead are commemorated 40 days after their passing, which is what we see here on this footage filmed in Qom. This ritual procession would soon turn into a protest, something that in the Shah's Iran was an extraordinary event. Every protest ended in blood and death. The dead were hailed as martyrs and commemorated 40 days later.
That's why we witnessed about 5 or 6 months of almost mechanically organized protests. We didn't need a committee to decide what day we would gather. We knew very well that on the 40th day, there would be a protest.
The city of Qom entered into a regular cycle of protests, which involved more than just the supporters of Khomeini. To keep the movement going, the revolting clerics made good use of the martyrs and the Shia Islam calendar. Although for the time being the uprising remained a religious one, the Shah was clearly facing a long-term revolt. In Poland, the strike at the Lenin shipyard in Gdansk, which began on Thursday, August the 14th, 1980, had spread to other workplaces in the region, which was now isolated from the rest of the country after the authorities had cut the telephone lines. The militants of the Workers' Defense Committee started trying to organize the strike and to make free unions the main issue.
It was Bogdan Borusewicz who organized the August strike, a historian, an intellectual. He did something incredibly innovative for the time, something very important. He began to think about who should lead the strike, who its figurehead should be. So he called Jacek Kuron.
Jacek Kuron had been fighting the communist regime since the 1960s. He was one of the brains behind the Workers' Defense Committee and the Free Unions movement.
He asked him, Jacek, who do you think is capable of leading the strike at the shipyard? Jacek immediately replied, there's only one guy who can do it, and that's Lech Walesa.
Lech Walesa was a shipyard electrician by trade, but out of work after being dismissed for taking part in the workers' uprising of 1976, and he was a hardened agitator.
He's a very contradictory and wide-ranging man. And he has a very authoritarian way about him, which comes from his culture. Not a typical proletarian culture, but a farming culture. And he had a political instinct that was very impressive.
Walesa was elected leader by the shipyard workers. From then on, he would be the main negotiator with the bosses.
In fact, the strike had 2 phases. The first phase ended on day 3 with success. Lech Walesa and Anna Valentinovich were reinstated into their jobs. There were pay raises and an agreement on a monument to commemorate the victims of the 1970 uprising. So a real success.
But the talks on the demands for free trade unions were abandoned halfway through, and the other plants that had joined the solidarity movement obtained nothing. Satisfied with their own pay rises, workers start leaving the Gdansk shipyard to enjoy their weekend break.
So Lech Walesa and Bogdan Borusewicz start strutting around like peacocks as winners. But then they see a woman standing in front of the gate. A tall, hefty, determined woman. Then in front of a second gate, another woman, Anna Valentinovich. And in front of a third gate, another woman. They were saying to the men leaving, "Where do you think you're going?" The men replied, "What do you mean? We won, we're going home." The women said, "Going home? There are other strike committees. Are you abandoning them? The authorities will crush them, kill them. You've got what you wanted, now you just leave?" And at that moment the leaders thought, now what do we do?
Realizing their tactical error, Walesa and the other organizers finally took action.
They turned on their heels and returned to the Health and Safety at Work office, where they declared the solidarity strike and the forming of a single inter-factory strike committee.
On the night of August the 16th to 17th, 1980, the Gdansk shipyard strike leaders were joined by the delegates of 47 other workplaces on strike in the region and laid down 21 new demands, with this time at the head of the list the recognition of free trade unions.
That was when the term solidarity was born and became the strikers' watchword. It defined our whole movement.
Within a matter of days, the workers' uprising had a leader and an organization. It had crossed the traditional lines, and pay rises would no longer suffice to bring an end to industrial action. In Tunisia, while the Sidi Bouzid uprising of Saturday, December the 18th, 2010 had caught most people by surprise, it had provoked a reaction from some militant trade unions and associations in the region.
We were scared that the authorities would come down heavily on Sidi Bouzid in order to subdue the unrest. So that's why we continually tried to spread the information, to tell the truth about the situation, because, as I said earlier, spreading the true information encourages others to get involved. In Tunisia, we have a big unemployment problem on a national scale, and it's particularly high among university graduates.
The fact that Mohamed Bouazizi was believed to be a young graduate was an ideal chance to mobilize militant networks, and notably the leaders of the General Union of Tunisian Workers, the UGTT, which had 500,000 members across the country.
The Sidi Bouzid region is known for its union activity. There are lots of union activists in the region. Basically, it was UGTT members, notably those in the inland parts of the country, who organized the social unrest.
It started on the street. It didn't start on Facebook. Sure, the internet and social networks played an important role, but you can't call it a Facebook revolution.
There were only militants with a degree of experience in opposing the government, be they from unions or associations, who had clear ideas about what demands we should make.
That's how the UGTT leaders and the militants of the Human Rights League attempted to kindle the uprising, structure it, and give it real purpose.
At that point, their plans had no intention of bringing down Ben Ali.
On Sunday evening, the uprising spread to the immediate surroundings of Sidi Bouzid. On December 24, 2010, in Menzil Bouzayan, a small town some 60 kilometers from Sidi Bouzid, youngsters stormed National Guard headquarters. And the irreparable happened.
A martyr was shot dead. The youngsters who were by his side had only two options: to run away and never come back, or to come back the next day knowing they could be killed. They chose the second option. They chose to die if need be.
Thanks notably to the mobilization headed by trade unions and associations, the revolt appeared to be holding and had spread throughout the Sidi Bouzid region. But the movement was yet to be structured, and leaders were powerless to prevent clashes between youngsters and the police. After the first moments of unrest, which catch everyone by surprise, political activists and members of trade unions and associations tried to keep the movement going. They used their know-how in an attempt to organize and develop the ongoing action. This is when the first demands are made, the first slogans appear, and the leaders first emerge. But while they guide, organize, and sometimes embody an uprising, they actually have very little control. As for those in power, they're now confronted with a whole new situation and they need to react fast. On May the 11th, 1968, French Prime Minister Georges Pompidou, on his return from a trip, will try his hand at appeasement. He'll appear live on TV and agree to the students' first demands. On April the 26th, 1989, the Chinese government will react in the form of an editorial in the People's Daily newspaper, accusing the students of plotting to repudiate the Communist Party. Here, those in power decide to use intransigence and threats. Confronted with sheer martyrdom, the Shah of Iran will continue his bloody and repressive policy against the religious protesters. He'll attempt to break the 40-day commemorative cycle. On August the 21st, 1980, the Polish government will choose to negotiate with the Gdansk-based Inter-Factory Strike Committee, sending in Deputy Prime Minister Jagiellonski to negotiate. On December the 28th, 2010, President Ben Ali will symbolically visit Mohamed Bouazizi at the Cyrus Burns Center in Belarus. He'll promise 20,000 dinars, about 10,000 euros, to Bouazizi's mother and a job for his sister. But will these different reactions manage to nip the uprisings in the bud?